At Thanksgiving, my parents blocked me at the entrance and said, "You're not welcome, go home." Inside, I could see my sister, my uncle, and even my best friend laughing together. I said nothing, returned to my car, and made a single phone call. 20 minutes later, my phone exploded, and the yelling started. That Thanksgiving afternoon, I pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in, only to have my parents block me at the front door and tell me flat out that I wasn't welcome and needed to leave. Over their shoulders, I caught a glimpse of my sister Lily, my uncle Ray, and even my longtime friend Sarah, all sitting around the table laughing like it was the best day of the year. I didn't argue or make a scene, I just gave a small nod, walked back to my car, and made one fast phone call before pulling away. Less than half an hour later, my phone started blowing up nonstop, and I knew the shouting had begun, even though I wasn't there to hear it. That driveway had never felt so long or so heavy as it did that day. Rain slammed against my windshield as I arrived, with a grocery store pumpkin pie sitting on the passenger seat, after I'd driven 3 miserable hours through bad weather just to be there. I had been looking forward to that one day each year when our broken family liked to pretend everything was normal. My mom opened the door before I even knocked, standing there with her arms folded tight, wearing the apron I'd bought her 2 Christmases earlier. The smell of turkey and sage poured out behind her, making my stomach rumble, and I smiled, ready to step inside and warm up. Instead, she looked at me coldly and asked what I was doing there, her voice completely empty. I laughed it off, thinking she had to be kidding, and reminded her it was Thanksgiving and that she'd told me to come at 4. She slowly shook her head and said no, that this wasn't going to work and I needed to leave. My dad stepped into view behind her, resting his hand on her shoulder but refusing to look me in the eye. Past them, I could see the dining room with the good china already laid out, Lily sitting in her usual seat with a wine glass in her hand, Uncle Ray animatedly telling a story, and then my eyes landed on Sarah, my best friend since elementary school, the same person I'd cried to just a week earlier when my rent went up. They were all laughing together. I tried to say my dad's name, but my voice cracked, and I asked what was going on. He cleared his throat and said that he and my mother had decided it would be better if I spent the holiday somewhere else, and that everyone had agreed. When I looked past them again, Lily glanced at me and quickly looked away, and for a split second I thought I saw either guilt or satisfaction on her face, though with her it was hard to tell the difference. My mom casually suggested that the neighbors usually hosted people, and might not mind another guest, like she was doing me a favor. My hands were trembling as I thought about the pie I'd wrapped carefully in foil, the ribbon I'd tied around the box, and the bourbon I'd hunted down at 3 different stores because it was my dad's favorite, all sitting uselessly in my trunk along with the gifts for my niece and nephew. I swallowed hard and asked what I'd done wrong, but my mom's face hardened as she told me this wasn't about me. It was about what was best for the family, and then she shut the door in my face. I stood there for a while on the porch, listening to muffled laughter and conversation through the walls as music got turned up inside. A familiar song that always played on Thanksgiving when I was a kid, the same one my dad used to dance to while carving the turkey. Walking back to my car felt unreal, like I was moving through thick water, and once inside I just sat there staring at the house, the wreath on the door, the pumpkins on the steps starting to rot, and the upstairs window that used to be my bedroom where I'd spent years dreaming about my future, a future that clearly hadn't turned out like I thought it would. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and paused for a moment before hitting call on Brooks and Hale Law Firm. The receptionist answered in a bored tone, saying her name was Nancy Clark, and I told her I needed to speak to Michael Brooks immediately about the Oak Ridge Trust. She reminded me it was Thanksgiving and the office was closed, but I insisted she tell him I called, knowing he'd understand. I hung up, started the car, and less than a minute later my phone rang again. Michael sounded out of breath when he answered and asked what was wrong, and I reminded him of what he'd told me the month before about my grandmother's estate. When he started to say we'd agreed to wait, I cut him off and told him I wanted to move forward with everything right now. He paused and asked if I was sure, warning me there was no undoing it and that my family would be affected, and I told him they just kicked me out of Thanksgiving dinner and shut the door on me, so whatever relationship we had was already over. I could hear papers shuffling as he said he'd need an hour to get access to the documents and start the process, reminding me this would seriously impact my parents and Lily financially, and I told him that was exactly the point. The drive home passed in a haze as I gripped the wheel while rain poured down, my thoughts racing through everything that had led up to that moment. My grandmother Helen had died 8 months earlier, leaving behind an estate worth far more than anyone realized, built quietly over decades of working as a nurse, living simply, and making smart investments. I'd been the only one who visited her regularly near the end, driving to the nursing home every Sunday to spend time playing cards, watching old movies, and talking about whatever came to mind, while my parents were always too busy and Lily refused to go because she said the place was depressing. A few months before Grandma Helen passed, she'd pulled me close and whispered that she'd made arrangements and not to let them push me around, which I'd brushed off at the time as medication confusion, only to later realize she knew exactly what she was doing. Her will shocked everyone, leaving everything to me with one major condition that I had to wait a year before accessing the inheritance while my parents managed her house and assets, but there was also a specific clause stating that if they intentionally excluded or mistreated me during that period, all restrictions would be lifted immediately and I'd gain full control over everything, including the family home she'd left in their care. Alan had explained everything to me 6 weeks earlier while we sat in his office, leaning back in his chair as he spoke carefully, telling me my grandmother had been sharper than anyone gave her credit for, and that she'd essentially handed me a nuclear option. He said the 1-year waiting period could be skipped entirely if I could prove intentional exclusion or mistreatment, but he warned me to think long and hard before pulling that trigger because once something like that was done, family relationships usually didn't survive it. I told him I needed time to think, that maybe things would get better, that maybe my mom's cold attitude was just her grief showing up sideways, that my sister Megan's nonstop criticism was just normal sibling stuff, and that my dad's silence was simply how he handled stress. Driving home alone on Thanksgiving turned out to be the slap in the face I needed to wake up. When I got back to my apartment it was dark and freezing, so I flipped on every light and dropped onto the couch, staring at my phone while the minutes dragged by. An hour passed, then a little more, and just as I was about to call Alan again, my phone went absolutely crazy. The first call was from Megan, and the second I answered she screamed so loudly I had to pull the phone away as she demanded to know what I'd done, and yelled that Alan Price had emailed Dad about Grandma's estate, and that I had no right to touch the house because it belonged to them. I hung up on her, ignored her immediate callback, let my mom's call go to voicemail, then my dad's, then Uncle Frank's, and then, for reasons I couldn't understand, Laura's. The messages started flooding in fast, Megan accusing me of tearing the family apart, my mom calling me selfish, my dad insisting we needed to talk calmly, Uncle Frank saying my grandmother would be ashamed, and Laura begging me to call her. I flipped my phone face down and walked into the kitchen, surprised by how steady my hands were as I poured a glass of water, briefly thinking about the pie still sitting in my car, probably ruined by now, and realizing I didn't care at all. When I checked my phone again I saw dozens of missed calls and texts, and the family group chat I'd been quietly removed from months earlier had suddenly come back to life just so everyone could pile on me at once. I opened it and saw Megan telling everyone I was trying to steal the house, Uncle Frank acting shocked after everything my parents had supposedly done for me, my mom announcing there would be a family meeting in the morning and that I would be there, and Laura insisting there had to be some kind of misunderstanding and begging me to call her back. I typed a reply, erased it, typed again, then finally sent a simple message saying I'd been told I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving dinner, not delayed, not sick, just flat out uninvited, and since that was the case, things were going to happen my way now. The chat went dead silent for about a minute and a half, then blew up all over again with Megan accusing me of twisting the story, my mom saying they just wanted a peaceful holiday, and that I always cause drama, and my dad calling it a massive overreaction. I replied that from where I was sitting, being told to leave your own family home on Thanksgiving felt pretty dramatic, but I guessed I'd learned that behavior somewhere. I muted the chat and called Alan back, and he told me it was done, the paperwork filed, and that as of that moment I had full control of my grandmother's estate, including the house, and that my parents had 30 days to move out unless I chose to let them stay. When I asked about the rest, he said all the investment accounts, insurance money, and savings had already been transferred to me, explaining that my grandmother had been extremely specific and had documented several times over the past year when my parents and sister excluded me from family events, including an affidavit Uncle Frank had signed confirming I'd been deliberately left out of Easter dinner. I was stunned, and Alan explained that Uncle Frank had felt guilty, had gone directly to my grandmother, and told her everything, which she then used to strengthen the will. I thought back to the look on his face at the table that night, the way he couldn't quite look at me, realizing he'd known exactly what was coming and probably tried to warn my parents before they ignored him. Alan then told me there was one more thing, that my grandmother had written me a letter, and that he was instructed to deliver it in person now that the transfer was complete, asking if I was available the next day, and I told him yes without hesitation. After hanging up, I sat alone in my quiet apartment while my phone kept buzzing with angry messages I refused to read. And instead I thought about every holiday I'd been shut out of, the birthdays I never got invited to, the family trips I only discovered through social media, and the constant sense that I was merely tolerated instead of wanted. Megan had always been the favorite, prettier, smoother, married to a successful guy, while my parents helped her buy her house, co-signed her car, and watched her kids every weekend. Yet when I asked my dad for help with my student loans, he told me I needed to learn responsibility. Laura's betrayal hurt worse than all of that because we'd grown up glued at the hip, and she knew exactly how my family treated me, had seen it with her own eyes, yet there she was laughing with the same people who had just shut the door in my face. When I finally read her messages, she insisted my mom told her I was sick and couldn't come, that she didn't know the truth, that it was all a misunderstanding, and asked if I was really willing to throw away our friendship over this. I replied that she'd sat at a Thanksgiving table I was explicitly told not to attend, stayed there while my mother said I wasn't welcome in my own childhood home, and that whether she knew ahead of time or not, she stayed, which told me everything I needed to know. She shot back immediately saying Megan told her I'd fought with my mom and told them not to expect me, and I answered that she believed that without ever texting me once to check, that she spent 3 hours eating dinner without asking if I was okay, and after watching the typing dots appear and vanish a few times, all she finally sent was a short apology. Yeah, I'm sure you are now, I muttered, and then I blocked her number without another thought. The following morning, Alan showed up at my apartment carrying a leather folder and a thick manila envelope, looking worn out enough that I figured he'd barely slept after dealing with my family's lawyers all night. As soon as he stepped inside, he told me my parents were already threatening to contest the will, and that my father had hired a big-name firm to go after it. I shrugged and poured him a cup of coffee, reminding him that Grandma Ruth had been examined by 3 different doctors before she died and every one of them declared her mentally sound, which was exactly what he'd already told their lawyers. Alan opened the folder and said he still needed me to understand what I was up against, explaining that my parents were telling anyone who would listen that I was unstable, that I'd manipulated an old woman, and that I was tearing the family apart out of pure spite. I told him they didn't get to rewrite the past, because they'd been tearing this family apart for years, while I was the one pretending everything was fine. He then handed me the envelope and said this was from my grandmother, something she wanted me to read only after everything was official. My hand shook as I opened it and found a handwritten letter on her favorite floral stationery, and as I read her words, it felt like she was right there with me. She told me that if I was reading the letter, it meant I'd finally reached my limit and that she was proud of me for it, explaining that she'd watched my parents treat me like an afterthought my whole life and that it broke her heart. She said leaving the estate to me this way might seem harsh, but she knew they wouldn't appreciate anything handed to them freely, and needed to understand what it felt like to lose something precious, the same way they'd made me feel unwanted for so many years. She wrote that the house was never about bricks or walls, but about love and belonging, something my parents forgot when they turned it into a trophy for appearances instead of a home built on care. She reminded me that I was always the one who saw the real value in things, the one who visited when it was inconvenient, held her hand when she was scared, and listened to her stories no matter how many times she told them, and that kind of love mattered more than any bank account. She told me to use the money to build a life that made me happy, not to let guilt trap me in relationships where I wasn't valued, and that family only mattered when the love went both ways, ending the letter by saying she loved me, was proud of me, and suspected whatever came next would be quite the spectacle. At the bottom, she added a note saying the house transfer paperwork was in the blue folder, along with documentation of every family event I'd been excluded from over the past 5 years because she'd kept track just in case I ever needed it. I had to read the letter 3 times before it fully sank in that she'd been planning this for years, quietly watching, documenting, and building a case while everyone assumed she was just a confused old woman who didn't notice what was happening around her. Alan said softly that she'd been something special and told me she once said I was the only person in the family worth saving. When my phone rang again and Megan's name popped up, I declined it without hesitation. Alan stood and warned me they were going to make this ugly and asked if I was ready for that, and I told him they'd already crossed that line and I was just meeting them where they were. Over the next week, everything spiraled fast. with my parents' lawyer sending aggressive letters accusing me of elder abuse, my Uncle Frank calling to beg me to reconsider and stop destroying the family legacy, Megan showing up at my job and screaming at me in the parking lot until security dragged her away, and my mom leaving voicemails that swung wildly from rage to fake affection to outright cruelty. I saved every single message like Alan advised, knowing documentation mattered. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, things hit a breaking point when my parents formally challenged the will, accusing me of coercion and claiming my grandmother had dementia, demanding the estate be frozen and investigated. Alan called right away and told me they were going all in and that this would go to trial, warning me it could take months and that they were already spreading lies about my mental health, my finances, and my relationship with my grandmother, asking if I was absolutely sure I wanted to keep going. I thought about that porch, my grandmother's letter, and a lifetime of being treated like an inconvenience, and told him I was sure. The trial prep was brutal, with depositions where my own family described me as unstable and desperate, witnesses lined up to paint me as someone capable of taking advantage of an elderly woman, and my sister Megan tearfully claiming I'd always been jealous of her and turned our grandmother against the family out of spite. The hardest part was watching them lie so smoothly, with Megan describing a childhood that never existed, my mom presenting herself as a devoted parent while forgetting years of cold indifference, and my dad suddenly finding plenty to say about my supposed flaws. During Megan's deposition, she sat across from me in pearls and a navy dress carefully chosen to look responsible and sympathetic, dabbing her eyes as she told the room that I'd always been difficult. Growing up, Megan had a habit of melting down whenever things didn't go her way, throwing fits that sucked all the air out of the room, and no matter what Mom and Dad tried, she still managed to push people away. Alan leaned forward during her testimony and asked if she could give specific examples of these tantrums, real details like dates, places, and witnesses. She hesitated and said there were plenty of incidents but couldn't remember exact dates because it was all so long ago, and he calmly pointed out that she seemed to remember them clearly enough to label my entire childhood with them. She shot me a look filled with pure hatred and then claimed I'd always been jealous of her, saying I barely congratulated her when she got engaged and never helped when she had her kids. I wanted to jump up and scream because I'd been her maid of honor despite her constant criticism, and I'd organized her baby shower while spending money I didn't really have on decorations she personally demanded, but I knew correcting her would only make me look defensive. Alan stayed even-toned and asked about text messages from 3 years earlier where I offered to babysit her kids and she'd replied that it wasn't a good idea because they needed stability, asking her to explain what she meant. She said she only meant I was busy with work, and Alan pointed out the earlier text where I'd clearly said I took the day off, asking if she wanted to revise her answer, at which point her lawyer called for a break. My mom's deposition somehow managed to be even worse, with her sitting stiff and upright, her face frozen into a look of wounded dignity as she brought out photo albums carefully chosen to support her story. She pointed to a picture from my high school graduation and said we were all smiling and happy, proof we were a close family, and Alan calmly noted the photo was 17 years old before asking if she had anything more recent that included me. Her mouth tightened as she claimed I rarely came to family events, and when he corrected that by saying I wasn't invited, she insisted I always was and just chose not to show up. Alan then produced printed emails, including one from last Christmas that listed everyone invited to dinner except me, and asked her to explain why my address wasn't included, which she brushed off as an oversight. He countered that he had records of 12 events over 3 years where I was deliberately left out of planning messages, and her composure cracked as she said smaller gatherings were easier because I had a habit of causing tension. When asked how I caused tension, she said I was overly sensitive and read too much into harmless comments, but when pressed for an example, she shifted in her seat and claimed I'd been upset one Easter because there wasn't a seat saved for me, which Alan pointed out was because I hadn't been invited at all. The room went quiet, her lawyer objected, and everyone knew the damage was done. My dad's deposition surprised me in a different way, because what came through wasn't anger but guilt, with him avoiding my eyes, answering in clipped sentences and contradicting himself. Alan asked when he'd last had a one-on-one conversation with me, and after a long pause he guessed it had been about 2 years, though he couldn't remember what we talked about. Phone records showed I'd called him 14 times in the past year and he'd answered twice for less than 5 minutes each time, something he quietly admitted was accurate, and when asked if he ever called me, he said he wasn't good on the phone. Alan pointed out that he spoke with Megan often, And my dad explained it was easier because she lived closer, even though the difference was 40 minutes versus 3 hours, hardly an impossible gap. For a brief second he looked at me, something like regret flickering across his face, but he quickly looked away and said we just drifted apart, a statement Alan gently challenged by asking if he drifted or pushed me away, an answer I could already see written all over his face. The character witnesses my family brought in were mostly their friends, people who'd only ever heard their side, like a woman from my mom's book club who said I seemed troubled and distant, and a guy from my dad's golf circle who claimed I'd been difficult even as a teen. But Alan had witnesses too, including my college roommate who testified about how I'd come back from family visits crying, and a professor I was close to who spoke about me confiding how invisible I felt at home. The most powerful testimony came from 3 staff members at my grandmother's nursing home, with one nurse saying I showed up every single Sunday without fail, rain or shine, bringing magazines, puzzles or flowers, and that my grandmother's face lit up every time she saw me. When asked if anyone else visited, the nurse said my parents came a handful of times in 2 years and my sister never came at all, something my grandmother noticed and talked about often. When pressed on what she'd said, the nurse explained that my grandmother believed I was the only one who remembered she was still a person, not just an obligation. Another nurse described an incident 6 months before my grandmother died when she fell and bruised her hip, explaining that I arrived within 45 minutes while my parents said they'd try to come later that week and never did, adding that my grandmother told her she'd made mistakes raising her son and didn't want that pattern of convenience-based family loyalty to continue through her estate. My parents' lawyer tried to tear down the nursing home staff, suggesting they were biased or didn't understand the full family picture. But the truth was already out in the open. What ultimately sank their case was how consistent and specific the testimony was, because these people weren't guessing or speculating, they were describing exactly who showed up and who didn't week after week, year after year. The most devastating moment came when Dr. Margaret Walsh took the stand, one of the doctors who'd evaluated my grandmother's mental state, and calmly told the court that Mrs. Ruth Morrison had been sharp as ever, fully aware of every decision she made, and had clearly explained that she wanted to give her granddaughter a way out of a toxic family situation. When Alan asked whether my grandmother had expressed even the slightest hesitation, Dr. Walsh said none at all, explaining that my grandmother told her it was the clearest decision she'd made in years. By that point, I was barely holding myself together, juggling depositions and court dates while taking a leave from work because I couldn't focus on anything beyond the case consuming my life, stuck in this strange in-between where my old life was gone but the new one hadn't started yet. Alan met with me often to prep for trial, and sometimes during those meetings he'd pause, really look at me, and ask how I was actually doing, and I admitted that some days I felt strong and justified while other days I wondered if I should have just walked away and let it all go. He told me walking away would have meant letting them win, letting them rewrite the past and pin everything on me, but I said fighting made me look exactly like the vindictive person they claimed I was. He shook his head and told me standing up for myself wasn't cruelty, that my grandmother understood how conditioned I was to accept mistreatment and gave me this option to break that cycle, even if it hurt. I told him I never imagined it would be this exhausting, and he admitted family battles always were, because there's no clean break from people who've shaped your identity your whole life, something I appreciated because he didn't try to sugarcoat it like everyone else. Nights were the worst, lying awake replaying memories and trying to pinpoint when my family decided I was expendable, wondering if it happened slowly or if there'd been one defining moment, and questioning whether they'd ever really loved me at all. I remember being 7 and spending hours drawing a picture of our family just to make my mom smile, only for her to glance at it, say it was nice, and turn back to baby Megan, and I remembered finding that same picture in the trash later that day. I remember being 13 and overhearing my dad say on the phone that he had one daughter who made them proud and another who was still figuring things out, and knowing immediately which one I was. I remembered being 23 and introducing my parents to my boyfriend, watching them stay polite but distant, then seeing them throw a full-on dinner party months later when Megan brought home the man she'd eventually marry. All those moments stacked up into a truth I'd avoided for years, that I was never wanted the way my sister was, that I'd been the practice child they learned on before getting it right with her. It didn't hit me like a shock so much as a quiet settling, painful but clarifying, because I realized I wasn't fighting to fix a broken relationship. I was fighting to accept that the relationship I thought I had never really existed. Alan was ready when the trial began, showing up with boxes of evidence including medical records proving my grandmother's competency, financial statements showing I'd never taken a dime from her, emails and texts proving I'd been excluded from family events, and testimony from nursing home staff confirming I was the only one who visited consistently. Then Uncle Frank took the stand, looking like he'd aged decades since Thanksgiving, and my parents' lawyer tried to bully him into walking back his earlier statements, suggesting he'd just told an old woman what she wanted to hear. Uncle Frank looked at my parents, then at me, and said plainly that wasn't true, explaining that Ruth had called him the previous March, upset after hearing I'd been uninvited from Easter, and had asked him directly if it was true, which he'd confirmed. His voice shook as he admitted he'd told her it had been happening for years, that his sister and her husband treated me like I barely existed and that Megan actively excluded me, and that Ruth asked him to document examples, which he did. My mom stood up in the gallery and shouted his name before the judge warned her to sit down or be removed, and Uncle Frank continued through tears, saying he thought maybe if Ruth knew the truth she could talk sense into them, that he never expected her to change her will, but that he was glad she did because someone needed to act after decades of watching me be treated like garbage. The courtroom erupted, my parents' lawyer called for a recess, Megan sobbed loudly, and my dad stared straight ahead without expression. After 3 grueling days, the judge ruled entirely in my favor, stating clearly that there was no evidence of coercion or incapacity, and that Mrs. Ruth Morrison had been a competent adult who made a deliberate and informed choice about her estate. The judge said the evidence clearly showed a long-standing pattern of exclusion and mistreatment, that the will was valid as written, and with that ruling, everything changed. My mother let out a scream that echoed through the courtroom, raw and unfiltered, and just like that it was over, with the house ordered to be vacated within 60 days. Alan handled every piece of paperwork while I tried to wrap my head around what had happened, because even though I'd won, it didn't feel like a victory so much as the final collapse of something that had been breaking apart for years. A few days later, Laura reached out through a mutual friend asking if we could meet for coffee, and I agreed mostly because I wanted to see her face when there was nothing left to hide behind. She looked awful, dark circles under her eyes and her usually perfect hair pulled back in a sloppy ponytail, and before I even sat down she blurted out that she didn't know and swore Megan told her I'd had a huge fight with my mom and chose not to come, that I was being dramatic and everyone just wanted a peaceful holiday without tiptoeing around me. I asked her if she really believed that, and she admitted she shouldn't have, twisting her napkin into shreds as she said she should have called me, should have questioned why I wouldn't even send a text, but that Megan had been her sister-in-law for years and her kid's aunt, and believing her version had felt easier. I asked her who it was easier for, and she flinched, admitting she'd messed up, that she'd been thinking about it every day, about all the times my family treated me badly, and she stayed quiet because speaking up would have been uncomfortable, choosing comfort over friendship and knowing that was on her. I stirred my coffee slowly and told her the worst part was realizing I'd spent my whole life making excuses for people who treated me poorly, my parents, my sister, even her, believing that if I was patient and understanding enough, they'd eventually see my worth, but they never did. I told her I needed her to see it on Thanksgiving when she stayed at that table, and every other time she watched my family shut me out and said nothing, and by then she was crying, asking if there was any way to fix it. I told her maybe someday but not right now because I couldn't keep being the person who forgave everything while getting nothing back. That conversation left me feeling empty and I drove home on autopilot, sitting in my car for 20 minutes once I parked, trying to process losing someone who'd been my best friend for over 20 years, someone I'd shared first crushes, college stress, career struggles, heartbreaks, and big dreams with, someone who'd been there when my first serious boyfriend cheated, and who I'd supported when her mother died. She'd also been there for every family slight and quiet cruelty, watching it all happen, benefiting from my family's favoritism toward Megan, welcomed into the inner circle and treated like the daughter they wished I'd been. I thought about all the time she defended them with little dismissals, saying my mom didn't mean it, that Megan was just stressed, that I was too sensitive, and how those comments taught me my hurt was the problem, not the behavior behind it. The next day, I went to see Uncle Frank, the one family member who showed any real remorse, because I needed answers. He lived in a modest ranch house in a quiet neighborhood and looked older than I remembered when he opened the door, the trial clearly having taken its toll on him too, and he hugged me tightly and invited me in for coffee. We sat at his kitchen table in silence for a while until he finally said he should have done more years ago, not just during the trial, and when I asked why he hadn't, he stared into his cup and admitted it was cowardice, that my mom was his sister and confronting her would have meant confronting how the whole family worked. He explained they avoided uncomfortable truths, swept everything under the rug, and pretended all was well, and when I joked that it must be a massive rug by now, he let out a tired, sad laugh and said I had no idea. He told me our grandparents were the same way, obsessed with appearances over authenticity, projecting a perfect image no matter how miserable everyone really was, and said my mom had grown up as the favorite just like Meghan while he'd been the disappointment. According to him, she absorbed those values completely and passed them on, genuinely believing some people mattered more based on how successful they looked, and when I said that was messed up, he agreed but said it was all she knew. He told me that when I was born he hoped she'd be different, and that she probably tried with me, but when Meghan came along and was easier, more social, and fit the mold better, my mom fell back into old patterns, seeing Meghan as her success and me as the rough draft. Hearing it said out loud hurt, but it also validated everything I'd always felt. When I asked why he'd helped Grandma Ruth with the will, he said he couldn't keep watching me get erased from family memories. That last Easter when they didn't invite me, he'd finally snapped and had a screaming match with my mom, who told him I was too negative to be around, and when he asked when I'd ever been given the chance to be anything else, she hung up on him. He told me Grandma Ruth called him a week later after hearing about the fight, asked him directly if the family was deliberately excluding me, and that he couldn't lie, and his eyes filled as he said she was devastated, admitting she'd suspected it for years but hoped she was wrong, and that she asked him to write down everything he could remember about how I'd been treated. He told me he wrote down everything, every skipped invite, every cutting remark, every moment they picked Gretchen over me, and that it took him 3 full days to get it all on paper, ending up with 12 pages when he was done, 12 pages spelling out what it meant to grow up unwanted and 12 pages proving I deserved better. He said Grandma Ruth read every word carefully, had the statement notarized, and then rewrote her will, explaining to him that she was giving me a way out but that I'd have to be brave enough to take it. We talked for hours after that, and he shared stories about my mom's childhood, the pressure she grew up under, and how dysfunction passes through families like an inherited trait, not excusing her behavior but finally putting it into context as a cycle she never stopped to examine. As I was getting ready to leave, I asked him if he thought my parents would ever apologize, and he shook his head and said people like them don't apologize because admitting fault would shatter an identity built on always being right, and they'd rewrite the past before they ever owned it. I said quietly that meant no reconciliation, no healing, just permanent separation, and he told me maybe things could change someday if they ever hit rock bottom, but I couldn't put my life on hold waiting for that and had to build something that worked whether they changed or not. He was right, and I realized I'd spent decades waiting for my family to become who I needed them to be. And the trial finally forced me to accept they never would. We said goodbye in the parking lot, and when he hugged me it felt different, distant, like hugging someone I didn't quite know anymore. The house sold for far more than expected, and I divided the money between savings, investments, and a down payment on a small cottage 3 hours from my hometown, far enough that my parents couldn't drop in, but close enough to see Uncle Kenneth, who quietly kept reaching out to rebuild some kind of relationship. My parents sent one final letter through their lawyer, full of anger and blame, ending with the line that I'd destroyed the family and would have to live with that forever. And I wrote back once in my own words saying I didn't destroy the family, I just stopped pretending it existed and that there was a difference. Months later I got a message from my niece Gretchen's daughter, who was 17 and had found me online, telling me she'd heard terrible things about me from her mom but remembered how I used to babysit her, take her to the park and show up to her school play when no one else did, and that she didn't think I was a bad person, just that the adults in the family were messed up and that she hoped I was happy. I cried reading it, then replied carefully telling her thank you, that she was kind and perceptive, that I was proud of her, and that if she ever wanted to reconnect when she was older I'd be here. But for now she should focus on being a kid and not fixing the adults around her. She sent back a heart emoji, and that was the last I heard from anyone else in the family. Uncle Kenneth and I started having dinner once a month, careful meals where we talked about his work, my new job, anything except the empty space where family gatherings used to be, and one night over Italian food he asked if I regretted it. I thought about it honestly and said I regretted that it had been necessary, but not that I did it, and he nodded and told me Grandma Ruth would be proud of me, and that he was too. My new life became quieter and simpler, with a cat, a small garden, and neighbors who waved and stopped to talk. And on Thanksgiving I volunteered at a community center serving meals to people who had nowhere else to go, which felt more like family than any dinner I'd had in years. Sometimes I still felt angry, sometimes I mourned the family I'd always wanted but never really had, and sometimes I wondered if I could have handled things differently, been more forgiving, compromised more. But then I'd remember standing on that porch in the rain, my mother's cold voice telling me to leave while laughter spilled out from inside, years of being treated like an obligation instead of a person, and my grandmother's letter giving me a way out even after she was gone. I knew I'd made the right choice, not the easy one or the comfortable one, but the right one. Around holidays my phone would buzz with messages from unknown numbers, Gretchen apparently getting new numbers just to tell me I was ruining her kids' lives. Or my mother's friends reaching out to say how devastated she was and how I'd broken her heart, and I deleted them all without responding. 1 year after that Thanksgiving I hosted my own dinner with Uncle Kenneth, 2 of his co-workers, my widowed neighbor, and a couple I'd met at a cooking class, all squeezed around my small table sharing food, stories, and laughter that wasn't polished but was real. No one's affection was conditional, no one was keeping score, and no one was waiting for me to mess up so they could shut me out, and I realized this was what Grandma Ruth wanted for me all along, not money or a house or revenge, but the freedom to build a life with people who genuinely wanted me there. When Uncle Kenneth asked what I was thankful for as we went around the table, I looked at the imperfect faces that showed up by choice and said honestly that I was thankful I'd finally learned family isn't who you're born to, it's who shows up when it matters. And when my phone buzzed again with another angry message from an unknown number, I turned it off, passed the potatoes, and knew for the first time in my life I was exactly where I was supposed to be.